On his 65th birthday, his own son dropped a stack of papers on the table, a $500,000 debt, and demanded it be paid by morning. No shame, no hesitation, just greed wearing the face of family. The old man didn't shout, didn't beg. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, the ice cracking like his heart, and simply said, "Okay." In that single word, love died and something colder was born. But what he did next would make his son wish he'd never asked. Subscribe for more revenge stories like this and tell us in the comments, what would you have done? They pulled up in a white Tesla that didn't belong to them, the kind of car people leased to look successful. The engine purred softly, as if even it knew how fragile the illusion was. He stood by the window watching through the blinds as his son stepped out, first phone in hand, sunglasses on, the picture of modern arrogance. His wife followed, adjusting her expensive coat, the kind that shouted designer, but couldn't quite hide the fact that it was secondhand. They didn't knock right away. They stood there on the porch rehearsing their lines like two actors before the curtain rose. When the doorbell finally rang, he took a slow breath and opened it, already knowing the warmth they'd try to fake. His son's smile came first, wide and toothy, but the eyes gave him away. Cold, impatient, already calculating. The wife leaned in for a hug that smelled of perfume and entitlement. She called him Dad, her voice syrupy, practiced. For a moment he let them play their parts. He gestured them inside, letting the quiet of his old house swallow the sound of their rehearsed affection. The living room looked the same as it always had, framed photographs, old furniture that had outlasted 3 economic crashes, a clock that ticked too loud when the room went still. His son's gaze flicked from wall to wall, not in nostalgia, but appraisal. He was scanning value, not memory. The wife ran her manicured fingers over the mahogany sideboard and said how charming everything looked, like she was complimenting a thrift store find. He poured coffee the way he always did when company came, but neither of them touched it. They were waiting, circling the subject like sharks testing the scent of blood. When his son finally spoke, his tone was polite but hollow. He talked about responsibility, about how family looks out for one another, about how times were tough. Each word sounded pre-written, a script he'd memorized on the drive over. His father listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. The older man's silence filled the room like smoke. He knew what was coming. He could feel the desperation behind every polished phrase, every forced smile. The wife added her own soft touches, how stressful things had been, how hard her husband was working, how lucky they were to have a father as understanding as you. The flattery dripped between them like oil on water. When they finally came to it, the words landed with the weight of betrayal disguised as reason. A loan temporary, just to cover a few business setbacks. They framed it as an opportunity, a bridge away for the family to stay afloat. But he'd been around long enough to recognize the smell of panic under the perfume. He asked how much. The number came out like a confession, $500,000. His son said it too quickly, too smoothly, as if saying it faster would make it sound smaller. He leaned back in his chair and studied them both. The son's jaw was tight, his fingers tapping against his leg. The wife avoided his eyes, staring at a family photo on the wall, the one where his late wife still smiled. Sunlight caught in her hair. He wondered what she'd say if she were here now, watching their son sell his soul for comfort. His son kept talking, filling the silence with justifications. He mentioned investments, a bad partner, unexpected market shifts. Every sentence was an excuse dressed in business terms. The father said nothing. He let the boy drown in his own words. Eventually, the wife reached out and placed a hand on her husband's arm, signaling him to stop. The air in the room thickened. Finally, the old man spoke, his voice calm but edged with steel. "You came all this way to tell me you're broke." The son flinched, barely noticeable, but the truth had landed. "We're not broke," the wife interjected too quickly. "We just need some help reorganizing our finances." He turned his gaze on her, slow and deliberate, and she shrank under it. He stood, walked to the window, and looked outside. The Tesla glimmered in the afternoon light like a lie polished to perfection. "Nice car," he said quietly. The son straightened. "It's a lease," he replied. "We're managing." The old man turned back, his eyes sharper now. "Managing? You drove 2 hours to beg for money, and you call that managing?" The words hit hard. His son's jaw clenched, his pride straining to hold the mask in place. The wife reached for her bag, pretending to check her phone, but her hands trembled. The silence that followed was unbearable. He could hear the grandfather clock ticking, steady and judgmental. Every tick felt like a verdict. He walked over to the mantel where his wife's photo stood and traced the frame with his thumb. She had warned him years ago, "Love your son, but never let him confuse your kindness for obligation." He turned back to them. "You have my answer," he said softly. His son blinked. "We haven't even—" "You already did," the father interrupted. "When you walked in here pretending to care." The wife opened her mouth to protest, but one look from him silenced her. "You didn't come for a visit. You came for a transaction, and I don't do business with liars." His son's face flushed. "We're family, Dad. You can't talk to me like—" "Like what?" "Like a man who's forgotten what that word means." The old man's voice didn't rise, but it carried more weight than shouting ever could. "Family is built on trust. You sold yours for a Tesla and a watch you can't afford." For the first time, the son looked small, like the boy he used to be when he'd come home after breaking something valuable. But this wasn't a broken vase. This was the shattering of everything left between them. The wife tugged at his sleeve, whispering something that sounded like, "Let's go." They stood gathering their coats with silent frustration. The son paused at the door, pride still clinging to him like a wet shirt. "You'll regret this," he said. The old man met his eyes. "I already do." The door shut behind them with a dull finality, the kind that ends more than just a visit. He stayed there for a long time, listening to the car pull away, the engine fading into distance. The house felt heavier without their noise, but it was a clean kind of quiet. He poured another drink, the amber liquid catching the light. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves, whispering against the windows. He thought of his wife again, her voice, her steady wisdom. She would have told him to stay calm, to think clearly, and he did. Because beneath the ache of betrayal, beneath the hollow ache in his chest, something else began to rise. It wasn't rage. It wasn't sorrow. It was clarity. He walked to his study, opened the drawer where the old legal files were kept, and began pulling them out one by one. He moved slowly, methodically, the way a man does when he's already decided on the ending. Outside, night crept across the yard. Inside, the old man sat alone, the ticking clock keeping him company, his pen scratching across paper as he made plans that would change everything. And when he finally leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile touched his lips. The son thought he'd come to collect money. He had no idea what he'd actually set in motion. The papers hit the coffee table with a slap that cut through the quiet like a gunshot. A thick envelope bulging with contracts and numbers spread open across the polished oak that had seen better conversations. His son leaned forward, confident, rehearsed every move too smooth for someone asking for mercy. He called him by his first name. Not Dad, not even Pop, just Richard, sharp, professional, distant. The word landed like an insult. Across from him, the daughter-in-law crossed her legs, her heels clicking against the floor as if she were keeping time to some silent tune of superiority. The old man didn't touch the papers. He didn't need to. He knew what they contained. Numbers, signatures, legal traps disguised as opportunity. He stared instead at his son's hands, hands he'd once taught to hold a hammer to drive a nail straight to build something real. Now those same hands hovered over spreadsheets and loan agreements, trembling just slightly, betraying the fear beneath the performance. $500,000, his son said, his tone smooth, detached. By noon tomorrow. It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. The father's heartbeat slowed, but the room seemed to shrink, pulling in the walls until every breath felt heavy. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply looked at the boy across from him and tried to recognize the child he'd raised. The boy who used to run barefoot through the yard laughing, chasing fireflies. But that child was gone. Sitting before him was a stranger wearing his son's face. His daughter-in-law smiled politely, her lipstick perfect, her voice dripping with false gentleness. It's really not that much when you think about it. You've got assets, retirement accounts, the lake house. We're not asking for charity. Richard, just support. Support. The word twisted in his gut. They'd rewritten family language into business jargon, affection into accounting. He leaned back, his hand brushing against the edge of the bourbon glass he hadn't finished. The ice had melted, leaving only watered-down remnants. He took a sip anyway, the bitter taste grounding him. "And what happens if I say no?" he asked quietly. His son exchanged a glance with his wife, then gave a small laugh that wasn't amusement so much as disbelief. "You wouldn't do that. You've always helped me. That's who you are." "That's who I was," the old man said, setting the glass down. The sound echoed like a gavel. The son's smile faltered, just slightly. "Dad, Richard, please don't make this harder than it has to be." The slip calling him Dad, then correcting himself, didn't go unnoticed. The wife leaned forward, voice soft but poisonous. "We're just trying to keep the family stable. Surely you don't want your only son drowning in debt." He stood then, slow, deliberate, like a man waking from a long sleep. His chair creaked against the hardwood. He walked to the window, staring out at the fading daylight. The sky was the same color as steel, cold and sharp. "You know," he said after a long pause, "your mother used to tell me, pride would be your downfall." I didn't believe her. Not until now. Behind him, papers rustled. The son sighed impatiently. "This isn't about pride. It's about timing. If I don't get this money, we lose everything. The house, the business, the cars. The father repeated softly as if testing the word. "Not the family. Not your integrity. The cars." His son pushed back in his seat, frustration rising. "You're twisting it. You don't understand what it's like out there. You've never had to." The old man turned sharply. "Never had to. What? Work for something, build it with my own hands? Keep a family fed when there wasn't enough to go around?" His voice didn't rise, but it carried a gravity that filled the room. "Don't talk to me about struggle. I've bled for every dollar you're asking me to throw away." The silence that followed was heavy and ugly. The son's jaw worked as if grinding down his anger. The wife glanced between them, calculating her next move. "We'll pay you back," she said finally, trying to reclaim control. "You'll get every penny." He smiled, then, not kindly. "You think I care about the money?" His eyes were on his son now, unblinking. "What I care about is the man who stands in front of me, the one who thinks he can bully his own father for a loan, the one who calls me Richard because he's too ashamed to say Dad while asking for a handout." His son stood suddenly, his chair scraping hard against the floor. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. You always do this, turn everything into some moral lesson. Maybe you like having power over me. Maybe that's all this is." The old man stepped closer, his expression calm, almost pitying. "Power, son. I lost that the day I handed it to you out of love. You just never noticed." The younger man swallowed, but the anger didn't fade. "If you don't help me, you'll regret it. I swear you'll regret it." The words hung in the air like the hum of an electric wire. The old man didn't answer. He just stared at him the way one studies a crack in a foundation, quietly assessing how long it's been there, wondering if it can ever be fixed. Finally he spoke, voice steady and quiet. "You've already made sure of that." The son's wife broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "We'll give you time to think," she said, gathering the papers into the envelope again, her movements sharp, irritated. "We'll come back in the morning." They left without another word, the door slamming behind them. The echo lingered long after their car pulled away. He stood there for a while, motionless, the scent of paper and cold coffee filling the air. On the table, a single sheet had slipped from the envelope. He picked it up. It was a loan agreement, his name printed in bold letters beside his son's, as though their identities were interchangeable. He stared at it, the ink blurring slightly as his vision burned with something between fury and grief. He walked to the fireplace, opened the iron gate, and tossed the page inside. The flame caught slowly at first, then roared to life, curling the edges, blackening the words until his name vanished in smoke. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, he poured himself another drink, not out of habit but necessity. His hands didn't shake. His heartbeat had steadied. The humiliation was gone, replaced by something colder, clarity, precision. He looked around his home, his sanctuary now defiled by the stench of greed, and felt the last of his affection harden into resolve. They thought they'd cornered him. They thought an old man would cave to pressure. But they'd forgotten who built this life from nothing. They'd forgotten whose name was on every deed, whose signature carried weight long before theirs even mattered. He turned off the lights one by one, leaving only the glow of the fire to paint the room in gold and shadow. Then he sat down at his desk and began to write. The pen moved steadily, the lines deliberate, the ink deep and final. When he finished, he folded the papers neatly and placed them inside an envelope of his own. The address he wrote on the front wasn't his son's, it belonged to his attorney. He sealed it, pressed his thumb against the flap, and whispered something only the empty room could hear. The next morning, when the Tesla returned, the house would be silent, the door unlocked, the coffee cold. But the man they came to manipulate would be gone, and in his place only the beginning of a reckoning. The words hit harder than a slap. If Mom were alive, she'd be ashamed of you. The silence that followed was heavy, echoing through the house like an aftershock. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. His son stood there, arms crossed, eyes cold, with the confidence of someone who believed he had won the argument. His wife, always the shadow whispering behind him, gave a small nod of approval, as if that cruel sentence had been rehearsed. The old man didn't react, not at first. His face stayed still, but his hands tightened at his sides until the veins rose under his skin. There were moments in life when pain didn't roar. It whispered, quiet and final. This was one of them. That single sentence did what years of distance, arrogance, and betrayal hadn't managed. It killed the last trace of affection he had left. He looked at his son and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. He wanted to say something to remind him of the nights his mother had stayed awake tending to his fevers, the mornings she'd skip breakfast so he could have the last piece of toast. But the words refused to come. Some things were too sacred to be wasted on the ungrateful. The son shifted, mistaking his father's silence for surrender. "We'll come back in the morning," he said, his tone clipped, impatient. "I expect this will all be settled by then." He placed the stack of papers neatly on the coffee table like a judge delivering a verdict. His wife picked up her purse, flashed a tight smile, and said, "We'll let you rest, Richard. You've had a long day." They left with the same fake politeness they'd arrived with. The sound of the door closing behind them was final. He stood in the center of the room, staring at the empty doorway. His reflection in the window looked older than he remembered, but sharper too, as if the years had finally stripped away everything unnecessary. He sat down slowly, the chair creaking beneath him. The quiet was unbearable. For years that house had been filled with laughter, arguments, music, and the smell of his wife's Sunday roast. Now it was just a tomb filled with ghosts of what used to be family. He ran a hand over his face, his fingers brushing the rough stubble along his jaw. His son's voice echoed in his head over and over until it became a pulse of rage. "If Mom were alive, she'd be ashamed of you." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. The room seemed to darken as the weight of those words settled in. He walked to the fireplace and picked up the photo that had sat there for over 30 years, a picture of his wife's smiling, sunlight caught in her hair. Her eyes had that same steady calm they always did, even in the worst storms. "Would you be ashamed of me?" he asked the photograph softly. "Or of what he's become?" The face in the frame didn't answer, But he didn't need her to. He already knew. He placed the photo back straighter than before and walked to his study. The floorboards creaked under his feet, the familiar sound grounding him. He opened the drawer where he kept the old ledgers, the records, the hidden pieces of his empire no one ever knew existed. His son thought he owned everything, believed every asset was in plain sight. But the truth was different. The old man had built his life like he built his houses, with hidden beams and foundations strong enough to outlast betrayal. He unlocked a small steel box from the bottom drawer. Inside were files, deeds, and an envelope marked "for emergencies." He'd written that label himself decades ago, never thinking he'd actually use it. But tonight felt like an emergency, not of finance, but of faith. He unfolded the papers, his fingers steady. Offshore accounts, a trust fund in another name, a safety net woven through years of discipline and distrust. It had always been there just in case. His wife used to tease him for it, calling him paranoid. "You plan for disasters that will never come," she'd say with a smile. He wished she were wrong. He poured himself another bourbon, stronger this time, and sat down to think. For the first time in years, he didn't think like a father. He thought like the builder, the strategist, the man who knew how to take things apart piece by piece until nothing was left standing. He imagined his son waking up the next morning, still smug, still expecting obedience. He pictured him walking into the house, calling out Richard in that fake, polite tone, expecting a check, maybe a lecture. Instead, he'd find an empty house and something far colder waiting. The old man's mind sharpened. He began writing a letter, clear and deliberate. Each sentence was a nail, each word a strike of the hammer. He explained everything his son had forgotten, the sacrifices made, the lessons ignored, the line that had now been crossed. But this letter wasn't a plea. It was a warning, one written by a man who no longer had anything left to lose. When the letter was done, he folded it neatly and placed it inside the same envelope as the legal documents. Then he opened his safe and took out a key, a small brass one that gleamed even in the low light. It belonged to a property his son didn't know existed, one bought quietly years ago in another state under another name. It wasn't grand, but it was far from reach. He set the key beside the envelope and exhaled slowly. The fire in the fireplace had burned low, the embers glowing like tired eyes. He poured water over it, watching the steam rise and fade. Then he turned off the lights one by one, each switch snapping with finality. In the darkness, he stood for a moment, listening to the creak of the house. It sounded alive, like it was holding its breath. He grabbed his coat from the rack, slipped the envelope into the inside pocket, and took one last look at the place he'd built. The air felt different, lighter somehow. Outside, the night was cold but clear. The streetlight cast long shadows across the driveway, and for the first time he didn't look back. He started the truck, the old engine rumbling to life, a sound that always reminded him of work, of creation, of survival. As he pulled away, he saw the white Tesla parked a block down, gleaming under the streetlight like a parasite waiting for its host. He smiled faintly, not out of humor, but certainty. They thought they'd broken him. They thought shame could bend a man like him. They had no idea what they'd just awakened. The road stretched ahead, dark and open, the city lights fading in the rearview mirror. He didn't know where he'd stop yet, only that he was done being their foundation. Somewhere out there the sun would rise on a new day, and when it did, his son would learn the difference between inheritance and independence. By morning the house would be empty, the accounts unreachable, and the empire shifted out of his son's grasp. But that wasn't revenge, not yet. That was just the first crack before the collapse. The rest would come later, quiet and inevitable, like the settling of dust after demolition. The house was silent when the decision took shape. The kind of silence that made every clock tick sound like judgment. The bourbon glass still sat on the table, half empty, the ice long melted. He stared at it for a moment, then pushed it aside. The anger had cooled into something sharper, clarity, the kind a man gets only once in his life when he finally decides he's had enough. He moved through the house like a shadow, slow and deliberate. Each step was heavy with memory. The walls that had once echoed with laughter now held nothing but the weight of disappointment. He opened his closet, the scent of cedar greeting him like an old friend. From the top shelf, he pulled down a weathered leather duffel bag. It had been his travel companion decades ago when business was booming and life had direction. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. He began packing without hesitation. Just a few clothes, a shaving kit, the documents from the safe, and a folded photograph of his wife. Her face smiled up at him, the same gentle smile that used to calm his storms. He placed it carefully between two shirts, as if she were coming with him, as if her ghost needed the seat beside him for what was coming next. In the study, he turned on the desk lamp. The golden light spilled across the papers he'd left earlier. His lawyer's number was scribbled in the corner of a notepad. He picked up the phone, hesitated for half a second, then dialed. The call connected on the second ring. "Alan," he said quietly, "it's me. I need everything moved. Tonight." There was a pause, then a sigh on the other end. "Richard, that's not exactly standard procedure. It's not a standard situation," he replied. "Transfer the accounts to the trust, the offshore one. Freeze all domestic access. Tomorrow morning they'll come asking for money. I want there to be nothing left for them to touch." Another pause. Then the lawyer's tone shifted from confusion to understanding. "I see. I'll need authorization. You'll have it in an hour." He hung up before Alan could say more. For the next half hour he worked methodically. The old files came out one by one, signatures, written papers sealed. He moved with the precision of a man dismantling a trap he'd once built for himself. The hum of the printer was the only sound in the room, steady, rhythmic, almost soothing. He checked the time past midnight. The air outside had turned cold, the wind rattling against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then went quiet again. He could almost feel the world holding its breath. When everything was ready, he went to the garage. The truck waited there, reliable as ever, its paint dulled by years, but the engine strong. He loaded the duffel in the back seat and paused. The workbench on the far wall still held his tools, organized, gleaming, a reflection of the discipline that had built his empire. He picked up a wrench, turned it over in his hand, and smiled faintly. The same hands that had built homes would now dismantle his son's illusions. Before he left, he walked back through the living room one last time. The photo frames lined up on the mantel caught his attention. Birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings. He reached for one, a picture of his son at age 10, missing a front tooth, grinning proudly with a fishing pole in hand. For a fleeting moment, his chest tightened. Then he set the frame face down. Some memories no longer deserved the light. He grabbed his coat and the envelope from his desk, the one addressed to his attorney, and locked the door behind him. The night air cut through him as he stepped outside. The cold didn't bother him. It woke him up. He drove without music, just the low hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires against the road. The highway stretched empty ahead, black ribbon under moonlight. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of obligation pressing on his shoulders. Each mile peeled away another layer of resentment, another scar carved by years of manipulation, disguised as love. At a red light, he glanced at the passenger seat. The folder of documents sat beside the photograph of his wife. He touched the edge of the frame and whispered, "You were right. He needed to learn. I just waited too long to teach him." The light turned green and he drove on. When he reached the city, the streets were nearly deserted. He pulled up in front of a sleek glass building downtown, the law firm's office tower. Inside, a night clerk startled as he stepped through the revolving door. The old man didn't explain. He handed over the sealed envelope with the authority of someone who no longer owed anyone an explanation. "For Mr. Allen," he said simply. The clerk nodded, unsure whether to speak. The old man turned and walked away before the kid could find the words. Back in the truck, he didn't go home. He drove instead toward the edge of town, past the warehouses and old industrial lots. The air smelled faintly of oil and rain. Finally, he stopped at a small storage facility tucked between two silent factories. The gate opened with a creak, and he parked in front of Unit 47, the number he'd chosen years ago for no reason other than it felt lucky. Inside the unit sat another truck, smaller, older, but perfectly maintained. A backup registered under a different name. He ran his hand along the hood, the dust cool under his fingers. Everything was ready, cash in the glove compartment, a new ID, keys to a cabin in Montana he'd bought in his wife's name long before. He took one last look at his phone before switching it off. The last text on the screen was from his son, sent hours earlier, unread. "We'll talk tomorrow morning. Don't make this difficult." He smiled faintly. "Tomorrow morning," he murmured. "Sure." He deleted the message, powered off the phone, and tossed it into the trash bin beside the gate. By the time the sky began to lighten, he was miles away, the city shrinking in his rearview mirror. A strange calm settled over him. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was reclaiming the life that had been siphoned away piece by piece, one guilt trip at a time. He stopped once at a gas station off the highway to fill up and grab a cup of black coffee. The clerk, a young man barely out of high school, gave him a friendly nod. "Long drive?" he asked. "Yeah," the old man said, stirring a packet of sugar into his coffee. "Long time coming." He stepped back outside, the dawn spreading across the horizon. The light caught the chrome on his truck, turning it to gold. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. Not the kind you buy with money or fake forgiveness, but the kind that comes from finally walking away. Somewhere behind him, his son would be waking up full of anger, ready to collect what he thought was owed. He'd go to the house, knock on the door, call the phone that would never ring again. And as the hours passed, realization would dawn. The empire he'd tried to claim no longer existed in his reach. The old man took another sip of coffee, watching the sun rise. The day was his again, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, almost calm. "Let's see how he survives without my shadow." Then he turned the key, started the engine, and drove north toward the open road where every mile ahead promised one thing: freedom, and the kind of revenge that didn't need fire or fury to burn. The first light of dawn stretched across the horizon as he parked a block away from the house he'd built with his own hands. The truck idled softly, its engine a low, steady hum in the cold morning air. He sat behind the wheel for a long time, watching the faint glow from the living room window. They were awake. Of course they were. People who lived off deceit rarely slept well. The white Tesla sat in the driveway, gleaming like arrogance made flesh. He took one final sip of his coffee, set the cup down, and reached for the small wooden box resting on the passenger seat. It wasn't much to look at: an old oak chest scuffed at the corners, brass hinges tarnished from time. It had been sitting in his workshop for years, buried under tools and sawdust. But what it contained now was far more dangerous than any weapon. Inside were the truths his son had ignored, the records he'd pretended didn't exist, and the proof of every lie that had built the illusion of success. He opened the lid one last time, the hinges creaking softly in the cold. The contents were neat, precise, deliberate deeds to the properties his son thought he'd inherit, bank ledgers showing where the real money flowed, signed loan guarantees that tied his son directly to the company's debts. On top of it all, he placed a single sheet of paper, handwritten in black ink. The words were simple, no more than a dozen sentences, each one sharper than any blade. "You wanted money. Here's the truth." He closed the box, locking it with the tiny brass latch, and stepped out into the chill. The morning smelled of wet asphalt and pine, the kind of air that felt clean enough to erase mistakes. He walked slowly up the driveway, his boots crunching against the gravel. The house loomed ahead, once his, now occupied by two people who thought they'd already won. He set the box down on the porch right beside the welcome mat his daughter-in-law had chosen, the one that read, "Bless this home." The irony almost made him smile. He straightened the box, adjusted it until it sat perfectly centered, and then stepped back. For a moment, he just looked at it. That small wooden chest contained the end of everything his son thought he controlled. As he turned to leave, the sound of a door unlocking froze him mid-step. His son's voice, groggy but irritable, cut through the morning air. "Who the hell is out there?" He didn't answer. He just kept walking, the gravel crunching louder now. Behind him, he heard the door swing open. Dad. The tone wasn't kind or remorseful, just confused, demanding the same voice that had always expected obedience. The son's footsteps followed onto the porch. The old man could almost picture it the moment his son's eyes landed on the box, the frown deepening, the curiosity sparking. "What's this?" he heard him mutter. Then the faint scrape of the latch opening. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The sound that came next told him everything. Papers rustling, a sharp intake of breath, the beginning of panic. Inside that box was the map of his own undoing. The deeds revealed the truth that every property was owned by a holding company under his father's name, not his. The loan agreements showed his signature tied to liabilities that would soon drown him. The business ledgers exposed the unpaid taxes, the siphoned funds, the accounts that had been quietly frozen overnight. He reached his truck and paused with one hand on the door. Behind him, the voice came again, louder this time, sharp and angry. "Dad. What the hell is this supposed to mean?" He opened the door but didn't climb in yet. He looked up at the gray sky, calm and steady. The air felt clean. "It means," he said quietly to no one but the wind, "you just met the truth you've been avoiding." Then he got in the truck and drove away, slow and steady, never once looking back. At the house, chaos was unfolding. The son dumped the contents of the box onto the porch, his hands shaking as he flipped through each document. His wife hovered beside him, her robe wrapped tight around her eyes, darting between the pages. "What is all this?" she demanded. "What did he do?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. The realization hit him in waves. His father hadn't left him money. He'd left him responsibility. All the debt, all the hidden obligations, every corner of the empire that the son thought was his to inherit now lay bare, poisoned with accountability. On top of the stack of papers, the wife spotted another note folded once, addressed simply, "To my son." She opened it before he could stop her. The handwriting was firm, precise, no hesitation in the ink. "You built your life on my foundation. You thought you could take it from me. What you forgot is that I built it to survive storms, just not yours." The wife dropped the note, her face pale. The son stared at it, his jaw tightening. "He can't do this," he muttered. "He can't just walk away." But even as he said it, he knew his father already had. By mid-morning, the phone calls started. The bank, the investors, the creditors who suddenly knew his name instead of his father's. The truth spread faster than he could react. Every lie unraveled in real time. Hundreds of miles away, the old man stopped at a small diner off the highway. He sat by the window, ordered black coffee, and watched the world wake up outside. The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, filled his cup without asking. "Headin' far?" she asked. "Far enough," he said, stirring his coffee slowly. He took out a small folded newspaper clipping from his pocket, an ad for a lakeside property in Montana, remote and quiet. The kind of place where no one asked questions. The cabin was already his, the purchase finalized months ago. His wife had once dreamed of retiring somewhere like that, surrounded by pine and silence. Now, it would finally serve its purpose. He set the clipping down and looked out the window again. For the first time in years, the tension in his chest had eased. He wasn't a man running from his problems. He was a man who had just finished them. He paid his bill, left a generous tip, and stepped back into the cool morning air. The truck waited, loyal as always. He climbed in, started the engine, and headed north. Back in the city, his son's world continued to crumble. Every door that once opened with his last name now closed in his face. Every call he made to fix things went unanswered. By sunset, the white Tesla sat abandoned in the driveway, a monument to arrogance. The box still rested on the porch, its papers scattered like the aftermath of a storm. The old man drove on the road, narrowing into wilderness. As night fell, the stars began to appear clear, sharp, endless. He rolled down the window, let the wind rush in, and breathed deeply. The air smelled of pine and freedom. He didn't smile, not quite. But there was something in his eyes, something between peace and vindication. What he'd done wasn't revenge in the fiery sense. It was truth delivered with precision, a reckoning carved out of love and disappointment. As the road curved into darkness, he thought of his son one last time. Somewhere that boy was standing on the same porch, staring at the same house, realizing too late that he'd never understood the man who built it. And in that thought, the old man found the closest thing to justice he'd ever need. The sky over Phoenix was still dark when he parked the truck in the long-term lot. The air carried that desert chill that slips into your bones before dawn. He killed the engine, sat for a moment and watched the horizon bloom from black to indigo. The city behind him was still asleep, unaware that one of its ghosts was about to vanish for good. He opened the glove box and took out his passport, worn at the edges but valid. One ticket sat beside it, one way to San Jose, Costa Rica. No return, no hesitation. He left the keys on the dashboard doors unlocked. Someone would take the truck eventually. Let them. He'd already taken everything of real value. The duffel bag was light, a few clothes, cash, documents, and the photograph of his wife he kept tucked inside a book. Her smile was the only compass he still trusted. Inside the terminal, the fluorescent lights hummed quietly, sterile and cold. The place smelled of coffee and carpet cleaner. Travelers shuffled by, half-awake eyes, red arms full of luggage, each of them chasing somewhere to be. He wasn't chasing anything anymore. He was letting go. At security, the TSA agent glanced at his passport and gave a polite nod. "Business or pleasure?" she asked without looking up. "Neither," he said, voice calm. "Just overdue." She smiled faintly, stamping the page, and waved him through. The flight was half empty. He took a window seat near the back where no one would talk to him. The engines roared to life, a low vibration running through the floor and into his bones. He looked out the window as the city lights shrank, the desert stretching endlessly below like a faded memory. Phoenix glowed briefly, then disappeared behind the clouds. For the first time in months, his body unclenched. The weight that had lived on his shoulders, that familiar ache of betrayal and responsibility, finally lifted. He wasn't running from guilt. He was walking out of a cage. Every mile between him and that house was oxygen. He closed his eyes, not to sleep but to think. The faces of his son and daughter-in-law flickered briefly like static on an old TV screen, loud, petty, and meaningless now. They'd wake up to silence, the box on the porch open like a wound, and realize what he'd done. The phone would start ringing before noon. Lawyers, bankers, reporters. The foundation of their fake empire would crumble by nightfall. He didn't need to witness it. Some revenge didn't require an audience. The plane leveled out, cruising high above the clouds. A stewardess passed by offering coffee. He accepted. The cup trembled slightly in his hand, not from nerves but from age. He took a sip and stared out the window at the endless expanse of white and blue. Somewhere far below, the world kept spinning, still full of noise and greed and people mistaking money for power. He smiled faintly. "They'll learn," he whispered. "Eventually." By the time the plane descended into San Jose, the sun was bright, painting everything gold. The humidity hit him like a wall when he stepped outside, thick, alive. Nothing like the dry air he'd left behind. He breathed it in deeply, his lungs expanding with something that felt like forgiveness. A driver waited near the exit, holding a cardboard sign with his alias scrawled across it. The name wasn't fancy, just one he'd used years ago when traveling for business. It fit him again now, a man between worlds, invisible if he wanted to be. The drive from the airport took 2 hours. The road wound through mountains and mist, past small towns, where children waved from doorways and old men sat outside cafes playing dominoes. The driver spoke little English, and he didn't mind. He let the rhythm of Spanish wash over him like a lullaby. Eventually they reached a narrow dirt road leading to the coast. The ocean revealed itself slowly, first a shimmer through the trees, then a wide open horizon that stretched forever. The driver stopped at a wooden gate. The sign was simple, Playa de los Pájaros. He paid in cash, thanked the man, and walked the rest of the way alone. The cabin stood exactly as described in the letter his lawyer had sent weeks before, small, whitewashed, with a porch overlooking the sea. The air smelled of salt and mango trees. Inside, the furniture was simple, the kind of place built for solitude. On the table by the window sat a small envelope with his name written on it, in the lawyer's neat handwriting. He opened it. Inside were the finalized transfer documents. The assets were secure. The accounts were clean. His son would find nothing to trace, nothing to claim. Every thread of power had been cut quietly in the night. He folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and left it on the table. Then he walked out to the porch. The tide was rolling in soft and rhythmic. He sat down in the wicker chair, the one that creaked like an old friend, and let the wind brush against his face. For the first time in years, he didn't think about money or betrayal or the long shadow of fatherhood. He thought about his wife. He thought about the laughter that used to fill their kitchen, the smell of apple pie on Sunday afternoons, the sound of her humming when she thought no one was listening. He closed his eyes and saw her standing barefoot on this same porch, smiling at him like she'd been waiting. "You'd have liked it here," he said softly. "Quiet, honest, no one pretending." The waves answered, steady and unchanging. He sat there for hours, watching the sky shift from blue to gold to deep orange. The ocean swallowed the sun, and for a moment the horizon burned like fire before dimming into dusk. When the stars appeared, he lit a small lantern on the table beside him. Its glow was warm and alive like the last heartbeat of the past. Somewhere far away, his son was probably shouting into a phone, trying to fix the unfixable. The image didn't bring him joy, but it didn't bring sorrow either. It was simply balance, the universe correcting itself. He leaned back, exhaled, and felt the tension melt from his shoulders. He'd given everything he could, years, effort, love, and now he'd taken back what was left, his peace. That was worth more than any inheritance. The sound of the sea filled the air, steady and endless. He reached for the glass of rum on the table, lifted it slightly as if to toast the wind, and murmured, "Here's to endings." The stars flickered brighter overhead, the tide rose and fell, and the night swallowed the last traces of his old life. Somewhere across the continent, his name was vanishing from ledgers, from accounts, from memory. And as the waves whispered against the shore, the man once called Richard closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen to the quiet freedom he'd spent a lifetime earning, and to the distant sound of the world realizing it could no longer touch him. Morning came heavy and gray over the suburbs, the kind of sky that warned something was about to break. Inside the two-story house at the end of Maple Drive, the smell of burnt coffee drifted through the kitchen. The son sat at the counter, phone in hand, scrolling through numbers that didn't make sense. His wife stood near the window, arms crossed, eyes darting between him and the small wooden box that still sat open on the table. Its contents were scattered papers, legal documents, a folded note written in his father's steady hand. He hadn't slept. The moment he opened that box hours earlier, the world he'd built began to tilt, slow at first, then faster, until everything was falling. At first he didn't believe it. His father was a stubborn man, but not cruel. Surely this was just a message, a scare tactic. But then the calls started. The first came from the bank, polite, professional, deadly. His accounts were frozen. Temporary, they said, pending verification. Then the accountant called, voice trembling. The business credit lines were gone, every partnership flagged for review. Within an hour, the office manager texted investors were pulling out. By 9, his phone buzzed with more notifications than he could read, emails marked urgent, headlines with his company's name beside the words under investigation. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out hollow. "He wouldn't do this," he said, pacing. "He wouldn't just—" His wife cut him off. "He already did." She pointed to the documents spread across the counter. "You signed those loans in your name, didn't you? You used his reputation to back them. Without him, they're worthless." He looked at her like she'd spoken another language. "They can't just vanish overnight. That's not how it works." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. He reached for the phone again, dialing his father's number for the 10th time. Straight to voicemail. He tried the lawyer next, disconnected. He slammed the phone down, breathing hard. He planned this, he muttered more to himself than her. He's been planning this for months. His wife moved closer, her tone softening but her eyes sharp. What exactly did you do to make him plan this, Michael? He didn't respond. He couldn't. The clock ticked too loud. The house that had once felt enormous now seemed to close in around them. Every shadow looked like judgment, every sound like a reminder of what they'd lost. The Tesla sat in the driveway gleaming, but he knew now it was just another illusion. The payments would bounce within days. He picked up one of the papers from the box, a deed. His father's signature was still on it, bold and permanent. The property wasn't his. None of them were. Every asset he'd boasted about, every investment he'd flashed at parties, all of it was tied to his father's name. And now that name had vanished like smoke. By noon the news had spread. Business partners he'd called friends stopped answering. One even blocked him. His assistant quit over text. Reporters began circling, calling from unknown numbers. "We'd like a comment, Mr. Daniels. Is it true your company was never yours to begin with?" He threw the phone across the room. It hit the wall, shattered, and fell to the floor in pieces. His wife flinched but didn't move. "You need to fix this," she said quietly. "Fix this." He turned on her, eyes wild. "How am I supposed to fix something that doesn't exist anymore?" Her silence said everything. He stormed out of the kitchen, through the living room where family photos lined the walls. He paused for a moment in front of one, a picture of him and his father standing side by side at the company's ribbon-cutting ceremony years ago. His father's hand rested on his shoulder, proud and steady. The son remembered that day vividly. He'd been so sure the old man was outdated, a relic holding him back. He'd convinced himself he was smarter, more ruthless, more deserving. Now the image looked like a warning he'd ignored. He tore the photo from the frame, crumpled it, and threw it into the trash. Upstairs, his wife was on the phone with her sister, whispering. He caught fragments. "We might need to leave. Everything's gone." "No, he didn't tell me anything." Her voice cracked on the last word, but he pretended not to hear. He didn't need pity. Not from her, not from anyone. By late afternoon, the house was unnervingly quiet. The phone line was dead. The internet cut off, the power flickering like the house itself was tired of pretending. He sat at the kitchen table, the same place he'd sat with his father days before, demanding money like it was owed to him. Now the same table was covered in the debris of his own downfall. The final blow came at dusk. A knock at the door. 2 men in suits stood outside, polite but cold. "Mr. Daniels," one asked. "We're here on behalf of the bank. You've been served." He barely heard the rest. "Foreclosure, default, recovery of assets." The words blurred together. He signed where they pointed, his hand trembling, then shut the door behind them. His wife came downstairs, pale. "What did they say?" He sank into a chair, staring at the floor. "It's over." She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just walked past him, grabbed her purse, and left. The sound of the door closing was quieter than he expected. The night came fast, swallowing the house whole. He sat there in the dark, the box still open in front of him, the note lying where he'd left it. "You wanted money. Here's the truth." He read the line over and over until the words stopped making sense. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the horizon, low and slow, like laughter from the heavens. He closed his eyes, exhausted, and saw flashes. His father's calm stare, the sound of papers burning, the faint click of a lock. Every detail of that last conversation replayed in his mind, but now he understood it differently. The silence, the stillness, the way his father had smiled just before, saying, "Okay." He thought it had been surrender. Now he knew it had been goodbye. By midnight, the house was cold and empty. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked, but everything else was still. He sat in the darkness, surrounded by the ruins of his arrogance, and finally realized what his father had given him. Not revenge, not punishment, truth. And truth he learned too late was the one inheritance that couldn't be spent or stolen. Far away in a quiet coastal cabin under the Costa Rican stars, his father slept soundly for the first time in years. Winter had already come and gone when the first letter arrived. No return address, just his name written in a shaky hand that once belonged to confidence. It came from a small town in Arizona, the kind of place where people worked with their hands and measured success by the sweat on their shirts, not the shine on their cars. The old man sat on his porch in Costa Rica, the sea humming softly below, as he slit the envelope open with the edge of his pocket knife. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. "Dad," it began, "I got a job." The words were uneven, like the writer hadn't touched a pen in years. The letter went on to explain he was working 2 shifts now, one at a construction site and another at a diner on weekends. He said he was renting a small room above a garage. He said it wasn't much, but it was his. The letter ended abruptly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I'm trying." The old man folded the paper, placed it beside his coffee cup, and stared out at the horizon. The sky was soft blue, the kind that made the ocean shimmer like glass. He felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Not pity, not pride, something quieter. Maybe relief. Back in Arizona, his son's days had become a blur of labor and silence. The morning started before sunrise, the air sharp with dust and diesel. He wore the same pair of worn boots every day, the leather cracked from concrete dust and rain. The men he worked with didn't know his story, and he didn't offer it. They called him Mike, same as the name on his lunch pail. They didn't care who he'd been before, only that he showed up, didn't complain, and carried his weight. At first the work broke him. His hands blistered, his back ached, his pride screamed. He'd once looked down on men like this, thinking himself smarter, sharper, destined for more. Now he stood among them, covered in the same dirt, breathing the same air. At night he came home to his rented room, one window, one bed, one bulb that flickered when the wind blew. It was there, in that stripped-down space, that he began to understand the thing his father had tried to teach him all along. He learned that dignity wasn't something you inherited, it was something you built. The first paycheck came small but clean. He cashed it, felt the weight of the bills in his hand, and realized it wasn't the amount that mattered. It was the effort behind it. He sent part of it to cover his debts. The rest went toward groceries and gas. For the first time, he didn't owe anyone anything. That night, he cooked a cheap dinner on a single burner and sat on the edge of his bed, eating slowly, quietly, without shame. Months passed. The routine became rhythm. He stopped counting days and started measuring progress, how many walls he'd helped raise, how many tips he'd earned at the diner, how many nights he went to sleep exhausted but satisfied. Sometimes when the desert wind blew just right, he'd catch himself thinking of his father, the calm in his voice, the steel in his silence. He began to write more letters. Short ones at first, never asking for money, never apologizing outright, just updates. Got promoted to foreman, bought a used truck, thinking about taking classes at night. The old man never replied, but he kept every letter neatly stacked in a drawer by his bed. Some nights he'd read them again before turning off the lamp, the corners soft from use. One evening, as the son finished his second shift, his manager handed him an envelope. "Some guy dropped this off earlier," he said. "Didn't leave a name." The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, deliberate, the kind that came from decades of signing deals and building things that lasted. Inside was a single note. "Proud of you. Keep going. You're almost there." No signature. No address. But he didn't need one. He stood in the parking lot for a long time, the streetlight buzzing overhead, the paper trembling in his calloused hands. For the first time in years, he felt something solid under his feet, respect, not just for his father, but for himself. The kind of respect that couldn't be bought, only earned. Weeks turned into months. He saved enough to move into a small house with peeling paint and a yard big enough for a dog. He planted a single tree out front, a sapling fragile and new. It reminded him of the one his father had planted when he was a boy, The one he'd knocked down years ago while showing off with a baseball bat. The memory stung, but it also steadied him. He watered the new tree every morning before work. By late summer, he had enough saved to book a flight. Not to Costa Rica, not yet, but to Florida, where he knew his father's lawyer sometimes sent letters. It took him weeks to track down the right contact. Finally, he left a message. "Please tell him I'd like to see him. Just once. I don't need anything. I just want to talk." The response came 2 weeks later, folded into a short note. "He'll think about it." Back on the coast, the old man sat by the water's edge at dusk, watching the tide roll in. He'd read the letter twice, then placed it back into the envelope. He wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. Revenge had done its job, but it hadn't filled the silence. Time had softened the edges of his anger the way salt smooths the edges of glass. He imagined his son, older now, sunburned and tired, but finally standing on his own 2 feet. He poured himself a drink, the ice clinking against the glass. The sky above was painted in gold and violet, the kind of sunset that reminded him of home. He thought about what it meant to be a father, to build, to lose, to forgive. Maybe forgiveness wasn't a gift to the other person. Maybe it was a release for yourself. He didn't write back right away. He waited until the next morning, when the sea was calm and the air carried the faint smell of rain. Then on a blank sheet of paper he wrote 8 words. "I'll meet you when the time is right." He folded it carefully, sealed it, and handed it to the courier. That night, as he sat alone on the porch, the wind carried the faint sound of waves breaking against the rocks. He looked out at the horizon and whispered, "He's learning." And somewhere hundreds of miles away, a man who once lost everything was finally beginning to rebuild. Not from inheritance, not from luck, but from understanding. The kind of understanding that only comes when you've been broken enough to know what really matters, and healed enough to start again. The letter came in early spring, carried by a courier who smelled faintly of salt and rain. The old man was on the porch when the young delivery boy approached, holding out a plain white envelope with his name printed neatly on the front. No return address. Just his name, strong, centered, deliberate. He didn't need to open it to know who had sent it. He could feel it the way fathers always know when something they thought was lost is finding its way back. He slit the envelope open with a steady hand. The handwriting inside was careful, patient, no longer the rushed scrawl of a man in crisis. "Dad, I'm coming down to see you. I don't know what I'll say, but I need to say it in person. If you'll have me." He read it twice, then folded it carefully and set it on the table beside his coffee cup. Outside, the sea breathed against the shore, calm and endless. For a long moment he just sat there, watching the horizon blur between blue and gold. When the day finally came, the sky was soft with cloud cover, the kind that made the light gentle instead of harsh. He waited by the porch, the same chair he'd sat in for nearly a year now, the ocean murmuring its endless rhythm below. A small rental car pulled up along the dirt road, its engine sputtering before going quiet. The man who stepped out wasn't the same son who'd once stormed through offices and dinner parties dressed in arrogance and tailored suits. This one wore jeans sun-bleached at the knees, a simple shirt rolled up at the sleeves. His hair was shorter, his shoulders leaner, and there was something different in the way he moved, not defeated but steady. He stopped at the base of the porch steps, eyes unsure, voice low. "Hi, Dad." The old man didn't speak. He just nodded once and gestured to the chair across from him. The son climbed the steps, each one a quiet apology, and sat down. For a while they said nothing. The sound of the waves filled the space between them. Finally the son broke the silence. "I used to think you wanted control," he said. "Over me, over everything. But now I get it. You were trying to teach me how to stand without leaning on you." The old man said nothing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The son went on, his words slow, heavy with honesty. "When everything fell apart, I thought you'd ruined me. I hated you for it. But the truth is, you freed me. You made me face myself. You made me earn something real." He leaned forward, his hands clasped. I finally understand." The old man exhaled long and quiet. It wasn't pride that rose in him, it was relief. The kind that doesn't come with victory, but with release. He looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not the boy who had betrayed him, but the man who had finally grown into his own skin. "I never wanted to destroy you," he said softly. "I just wanted you to stop destroying yourself." The son's eyes glistened, but he didn't look away. "I know." They sat there for a while, the ocean moving in steady rhythm below them, the world finally at peace. The air smelled of salt and orange blossoms from the trees that had started to bloom near the cabin. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Eventually the son reached into his bag and pulled out a small envelope folded neatly. "I brought this," he said, sliding it across the table. "It's a check. The money I owed. It's not everything yet, but it's a start." The old man didn't touch it. He just smiled faintly. "Keep it," he said. "You've already paid me back." The son frowned. "How?" "By learning," he said simply. "By becoming the man your mother always believed you could be." For the first time in years, the son laughed, soft, genuine, unguarded. It was the sound of someone remembering who they were before greed and pride took root. The old man joined him, the two of them laughing quietly, like the ocean itself had shared the joke. Later they walked down to the beach barefoot, the sand cool beneath their feet. The son picked up a small piece of driftwood, turning it in his hands. "I used to think strength meant having everything," he said. "Now I know it means being able to lose and still move forward." The old man nodded. "Took me half my life to learn that." They stood at the water's edge as the tide rolled in, touching their feet before pulling back again. The son turned to his father. "Do you ever think Mom would forgive me?" The old man's voice was soft, almost carried away by the wind. "She already has. She'd have been proud you came here today." They watched the horizon together, the light shifting as the sun dipped lower. The son picked up a small stone and tossed it into the sea. It disappeared with a quiet splash. "Feels like a clean start," he said. "It is," his father replied. "Every sunrise is if you let it be." When they walked back toward the cabin, the old man put a hand on his son's shoulder. Not heavy, not commanding, just there. The gesture said everything. Words didn't need to. Inside, they shared a meal of simple food and quiet conversation. The son talked about the new life he was building, the work, the friends who didn't care who he used to be. The father listened, content, his heart steady. When the evening came to a close, the son stood at the door, hesitating. "I don't know when I'll be back," he said. "You don't have to know," the old man replied. "You just have to keep walking forward." They looked at each other for a long moment before the son finally stepped forward and hugged him. It wasn't the quick, awkward hug of obligation. It was something deeper. A recognition, a homecoming. After he left, the old man stepped back out onto the porch. The sky was burning orange over the water, the world quiet and whole again. He poured himself a drink and sat in his chair, the sea stretching endlessly before him. Sometimes he thought revenge didn't have to end with ruin. Sometimes it ended here in silence, in forgiveness, in the steady heartbeat of understanding. He took a slow sip, watching the last of the daylight fade. Somewhere out there his son was driving away, carrying with him not shame but peace. The old man smiled to himself, the kind of smile that carried no triumph, only truth. Because in the end, he'd learned what so few ever do: real justice doesn't come from destruction. It comes when the lesson finally takes root, and love long buried beneath the ashes begins to grow again. Life has a way of teaching lessons that comfort can never offer. This story reminds us that love sometimes means letting go. That real strength isn't about holding on. It's about allowing others to face the truth even when it hurts. For many older adults, it's a familiar ache watching someone you love lose their way and realizing you can't save them from themselves. But wisdom knows when to stop rescuing and start trusting life's harder lessons. In the end, justice isn't always about revenge or punishment. It's about awakening, about seeing growth where pain once lived. When we step back, we allow others the chance to stand tall, to earn dignity the way we once had to. And when they finally return, not in pride but in understanding, we realize forgiveness isn't weakness. It's peace. If you've ever faced betrayal, disappointment, or the pain of letting go, remember, sometimes silence teaches louder than anger ever could. Subscribe for more powerful revenge stories that turn life's hardest moments into wisdom, and share your own story in the comments below. Someone out there might need your lesson today.